Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a 2-part interview in which Mark and I are talking with Craig Gallant about the sci-fi, fantasy, and alternative history books that he's written with us.
Welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. From fantasy to sci-fi to history and horror, your hosts are about to take you on a journey through all things Winged Hussar Publishing. Sit back and relax as we talk about writing, gaming, as well as interview some of your favorite authors. Let's wing it.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Brandon, here once again with Mark.
I'm Mark. I'm slightly upset that Brandon didn't read the question mark I put on the teleprompter.
Yes, Mark and I have inside Ron Burgundy jokes, and reading my script, I saw a question mark that I'm like, I didn't write that. I'm like, that was Mark. And we are rejoined by our talented friend, Craig Gallant.
Hi, I'm Craig Gallant. And I don't have a question mark. I have an exclamation point.
It's all about keeping it different. This is part 2 of the interview, so as normal, we will not hold back in regards to spoilers when talking about the novels. So if you haven't read any of Craig's novels, be warned, we're getting into the background details and the nitty-gritty things. And if you have read the novels, be ready to enjoy a little bit of behind-the-scenes look and pulling back the curtain on the process and the characters. Before we get into all that, though, I'm going to drop a little behind-the-scenes trivia for our loyal fans listening about where the show has been. This part 2 is being recorded almost close to a year after we recorded part 1. So if things seem a little disjointed, bear with us. We had a little bit of a technical issues and we had to take a pause for a little bit. But the interview with Scott, the first interview with Craig, and the episode that's actually coming out after this one, episode 14, they were all in the can for almost a year. So we are back to recording, and what better way than to wrap up the interview we had with Craig.
No.
So, Craig.
Yes.
As we've talked about in the last episode, you've been with us since the beginning of Winged Hussar Publishing.
I have.
You started with the Wild West Exodus books and then just ran rampant from there on everything you've wanted to do. You've been our go-to in fantasy, sci-fi, everything. You've kind of run the gamut on all the different types of books that we have.
I've been living the dream.
And it's been a dream working with you.
Well, thank you. And it's been a dream working with all of you as well.
And Mark is just kind of there, but you know.
No, Mark is a dream also. I've worked with Mark. Mark and I tied in a couple books together, and I enjoyed it immensely.
I've always said I prefer you, Craig. I've always said it.
So, Craig, speaking of which, what setting do you feel the most at home in? Where do you feel more comfortable?
Well, that's a great question, Brandon, and one that unfortunately I can't really answer. Just like my reading, I'm a voracious reader. I love reading all kinds of different things, and I love writing in all kinds of different genres. So it's really hard. I approach all of these stories more from a human standpoint than a genre standpoint, and I think a lot of my books kind of blend genres. I'm not a purist by any stretch of the imagination, so I like a little mysticism in my sci-fi. I like a little hard physics in my fantasy. I very much like rules across the board, and I think one thing that was hammered into me relatively young as a fan before I started creating my own stuff was internal consistency. And so I think that's far more important than a genre tag. So if something is established and then you go against it, whether it's rocket ships or swords or the way magic is supposed to work, that's where your problem comes in. And I would much prefer to write good anything. Well, not romance. I don't want to do romance. I think I'm going to draw the line at romance. Although, a little romance dropped into other genres is good, but I love sci-fi. I love fantasy. Sometimes it's mood dependent, but almost always I can jump into anything and really enjoy it.
Absolutely. And I think with any good novel, with a diverse cast of characters, I think there's always going to be some sort of a, not romance, but romantic, like, intent hinted.
Well,
And
they're
I think
going to have
you've had that.
relationships, right? And
Yeah,
if
exactly.
they're real relationships, then they're going to be something that the reader's going to identify with, something that they're going to recognize. And romance, of course, is part of the human condition, I think.
Right, and when you remove that, I think you really see you feel something missing. And that's something we talked about in the early days with the Jesse James novels, is that, you and I both kind of were on the same page about, we need this like little romance subplot going on, and the powers that be kind of told us, no, we're not going to have anything to do with that at all. And you could feel the lack, what not having that meant on the plot. You felt something missing.
I mean, obviously, you're not going to write a book about the day that nothing happened, right? So there's something happening as the backdrop of that. And as far as I haven't given too much thought about romance novels, but I believe the thing that's happening in a romance novel is the romance, right? But in sci-fi and fantasy and adventure, in any of these genres that we're dealing with, you're talking about war, you're talking about battles, you're talking about intrigue, you're talking about betrayal. These are all the things that are happening on that day. And so romance is not going to be front of mind for these characters for the most part, right? But their lives, generally speaking, can't be devoid of an awareness of that kind of thing, but it's not generally going to be a focus.
Right. And that's what I think.
It's it's all right. I was just going to speak, but you go for it.
I was going to chime you in, actually. I was going to say, Mark, the king of the beautiful people writing. Would you like to? I think you can include. You can attribute to this.
Yeah, that's the only reason I was going to speak. Was just like, well, we're speaking about pretty people. Well, I'll say something. Not me, just my characters. Yeah, I think you're entirely right in that. What you said about the human condition. It's like, okay, so if you want to. There's plenty of successful stories about there that might be set within an hour. You can have a real-time movie that's an hour and a half, and that's fine. You can have it completely devoid. Just like you can have characters who either are not wired that way, and it's not a part of their life, or the whole story is within a professional context.
Right.
Therefore, it's not part of the story. But if you're doing a story set over a reasonable time frame, with a spread of different characters, to have not one of them have a romantic relationship, I think would be odd. They don't all need to have it. In fact, it's going to be a bit off-kilt if they all do. It doesn't need to dominate, but the complete absence of it, yeah, I totally agree. It's like it's not the theme I'd want to write as the major theme, but if it's not there, I mean, fair enough. People have written stories like where it's about orcs or whatever, where it's like, okay, unless it's Amazon Prime orcs, then yeah, okay. Having an absence of it is fine. It's absolutely fine. But if you're writing about something which is a bit more akin to, society on the whole as we know it, yeah, the absence of it's kind of weird, I think.
To kind of drill down a little bit, it's actually a cheap way of making your characters more relatable. I mean, there's
absolutely
your reader's not going to generally relate to world-shattering violence and death and destruction, but they've probably had a crush on somebody. They've probably been distracted by an attraction at one point or another, or had that be a motivating factor, good or bad, for good or ill in their life. And so you drop something like that in, even if it's just like, I'm a huge fan of fig leaves, right? You put a little mention in it, a sentence or two here or there, and the reader now knows, like, this person's looking at that. Oh, this person's aware of that person, and I know how that feels, right? And it gives them a window or a hook into that character that otherwise may be lofty and inaccessible.
I'm going to misappropriate a Metal Gear Solid quote here for something Mark said. Snake, do you think orcs can find love on the battlefield?
On Amazon Prime, they can.
Yeah. Oh, you just beat me to it.
You get full credit, Mark. I wasn't even thinking about the Amazon Prime orcs until you mentioned them.
Oh, they're lovely, aren't they?
They just want to have families, Mark. Leave them alone.
Yeah.
They have babies just like
Back off the
everybody
orcs,
else.
Okay? Oh,
Okay, moving away from orcs and back into Craig Gallant. Let's start talking about some of your novels.
Okay.
I think a good one to start with is Legacy of Shadow.
Love it.
And I think that was the first novel that you sent me like character pictures for. And I think mostly because prior to that we'd been working within the realm of the characters that already existed, and you were making a story based off the characters. So when I got that sheet of the characters and their pictures, that was like perfect for me because I was able to instantly attribute what they looked like, and all the details matched up. So I think that was I think you're the only author to ever do that, and it made it so much easier to get into it immediately and have that picture in my head of I knew exactly what you were looking at.
Well, it's a shame we can't give the readers that.
That's true, because some of the images were copyright infringement to include
pretty much all of them, actually.
Yes.
So what I used to do before I did that was literally physical index cards, and I can't remember. It was some book on writing that recommended that, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. All of my Wild West Exodus novels, I still have them. I have a file card. A card file of all of those characters. So when I had a scene with those characters, I would pull all of those cards out, and they would have a description of them. They would have some words that I would use on a regular basis when they came up. As far as temperament goes, as far as physical appearance goes, I would have their sort of uniform, in scare quotes, described their favorite weapons, and then those cards evolved as a character was wounded. That was noted on the card. As a character had some developmental moment, that was noted on the card. But eventually it did get really annoying flipping through all these cards and having to like every chapter I would have to rearrange my workspace. And when you guys gave me the literally the dream of a lifetime, the opportunity of a lifetime to write my own novel without being beholden to other people's IPs or other people's ideas and characters, the most daunting thing to me was I want these characters to be real, and I want them to not to change from one scene to the next, from one chapter to the next. I don't want Marcus to be tall in one and short in the next, and I don't want these aliens to be one color and one, at the beginning of the book, and then at the end of the book they're all red. And so what I started to do was I ported my format of these character cards into a Word document, and then I just pasted a ton of blanks, and every one of them has a space for a picture. And what I did was, for instance, I'll give you one example. Right, Marcus, the main character in Legacy of Shadow, in my head was a young Robert Downey Jr. With a beard, with a goatee. And so I went and I found a picture. There's a million of them, but I found one that really resonated with me. This is what Marcus looked like to me. And so now when I'm writing Marcus, I'm describing that character. I'm describing that picture of Robert Downey Jr., but the reader doesn't know that. The reader is never going to know, except now that we're giving away all the secrets, that's the description, right? And so I can maintain a consistent description throughout. It's super easy just to scroll up and down in that document. I have attitudes. I have favorite sayings. As I've developed this concept, I have like some phrases or words that they use on a regular basis that I kind of want to key to or use as hooks. I have their weapons of choice. I have attitudes they might have about different things. And so I have all of that at my fingertips. And if I forget what somebody looks like, then I can just go on there and find out. I don't even know who half the people are that the pictures that it was literally years before I found out who some of the people were, and I was a little shocked. And for instance, many of the characters in Legacy of Shadow are aliens, right? Most of the pictures are of humans, and so underneath the picture is then white hair and blue skin or whatever, and so it kind of like keys in there and gives me again something to refer to so that I can maintain a consistency throughout. And I really, really enjoyed that. It made it much easier for me to track what was going on. And really all I did for a lot of the aliens, I thought, okay, the overwhelming kind of theme of this alien is going to be like they're a guard dog kind of mentality. Okay, so I'm gonna go online and I'm gonna do a Google search for aliens, and then I'm gonna refine it and look for dog-like aliens, and what I'm gonna get is a bunch of these pictures, and a lot of them come from DeviantArt, which is a great source if you're just looking for inspiration.
Absolutely.
And then those are then plugged into that document, and every time one of those aliens pops up, I have that right on my screen, and I'm describing what I'm looking at. And it's kind of like it just maintains that consistency and gives me inspiration moving forward. Whereas because it's purely a written medium, there's no visual context to it. The reader is supplying their own, interpretation of my words. And that was last year when we went to Balticon and we talked to some people. That was one of the most interesting things that I was hearing, were the way other people envisioned my alien races and things that they picked up on. I'm not George R.R. Martin in any way, shape, or form. In so many different ways that I wish I was George R.R. Martin, I am not. Although I am more prolific than George R.R. Martin at this point in our chosen careers. But I don't focus on food is what I'm going with. And so I don't spend a lot of thought on what people are eating. I do like to kind of touch on, use it as a touchstone for culture.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure we'll talk later about Team Z, but in Team Z, I touch on some food items because I think it's interesting to see how, people who live in with the constant threat of 0G what would they be eating? How would they be eating? But for the most part, I don't really much pay a lot of attention to what people are eating. And apparently there are some people out there who have noticed that I guess all of my good guys in Legacy of Shadow are vegetarians, and all of my bad guys in Legacy of Shadow are meat eaters. And that has somehow in somebody's mind translated to the fact that I am a vegan and I abhor meat and meat eaters, and it's some kind of anti-carnivore agenda that I'm pushing. And I'm just here to tell you that I like a steak. So
yeah,
I'm a big fan of meat,
you.
and so that was just pure. If that is true, and I don't know that it is, I have not gone back to the book to do an analysis of what everybody's eating. Although someday I might, just out of curiosity. If it is true that those characters are all their eating habits fall into that line, it was purely coincidental, I assure you.
I've been to many of an Adepticon dinner with you, and I can attest to, yes, I've seen you eat meat, and
I enjoy a good steak.
I didn't pick up on that, but I also probably wasn't looking for that per se, as I was looking for,
no, and that's the interesting thing is that everybody's going to take something different out of your writing, right? And quite often they're going to take something out of your writing you never intended for it to be there, and as long as it doesn't go against your overall messaging or themes, then more power to them. And the carnivore vegan thing was just a particularly intriguing element to that, and does inspire me for sequel ideas in the future. However,
there you go. I have to say that one of the things when I was reading that, it's difficult to create an original universe in a sci-fi setting because it's, how do you do aliens, more or less? There are so many different ways to do aliens, and some people really struggle to properly depict them because of the whole concept of them being aliens. You want to, you have to straddle the line of, do you make them human-like aliens? Do you make them completely different? And I think a lot of people struggle with how to create compelling, interesting aliens. And when I read your novel, I told you, and I continuously say it to this day, it gave me a very much Mass Effect or Star Wars feel. So you can tell the love and the thought that went into creating these aliens in this universe. And, Mark and I have talked about this constantly, and, we've talked about it on the episode about, IP versus original setting. There's a lot of thought and, creativity that you have to put into writing an original universe. And I think that you've done that really well.
Thank you.
And I was going to originally ask you how much thought went into that, but I think as we can tell from this conversation, there was a lot that went into it.
Well, each alien race actually has its own card in the document that I sent you.
Nice.
And
yes,
so
I remember that.
The characters have their cards, but the races have their cards. I lean into the idea, in psychology, there's this concept where it deals with creativity, that you cannot create something new, that our brains cannot conceive of something actually new. What we do is create amalgamations of things that we know and that we are familiar with, and we try to find a new, organizational structure for those elements and then, so I think a lot of people a lot of the trouble people run into with aliens is, I'm going to bring something brand new, but you can't. I believe you can't. I mean, I know there are people who believe they can. I believe that I can't. So if I know that I can't, then I'm going to lean into the idea that what I am going to do is take things that I do know and blend them into hopefully a new organizational structure, a new pattern that will serve my story, because that's ultimately what I'm doing. I'm telling a story. So I am fascinated when I read. I read a lot about writing and other authors and their strategies and their approaches. And I know lately I have been focusing on because with a restructuring at school, I'm going to be teaching a class in science fiction and fantasy, which is very exciting to me.
Nice.
So I've been doing a lot of digging into that so I can have a more educated conversation. It's a senior class, so these are going to be 18-year-olds. Their brains are, finally forming, and they're going to have more advanced conversations. And what I'm finding are a lot of authors that sort of break down into two different camps: the architect and the gardener. And the architect plans everything out ahead of time, has an outline, knows where everything's going, and then fleshes it in as they write. And the gardener has a basic sense of where they want things to go, but they're going to then let their characters kind of run rampant and be excited about new twists and turns that they didn't even think about. And I am very much an architect. So gardeners, as far as writing, planning, they scare me and confuse me, and I don't know how you can structure. And I'm sure they can. And Stephen King, as one example, says he doesn't use an outline at all. So I know it can be done. I just can't conceive of a brain that can do it, I guess, would be how I would relate to that. And so I go into this with a structure and an idea of where I want everything to go and a story that I want to tell. These alien races are part of that story. They're not incidental to my story. So I need somebody that's going to do this. Well, why would they do that? Okay, is it cultural or personal? If it's cultural, what kind of culture would result in a person that does that sort of thing? I have an entire race of victims in Legacy of Shadow. You only meet one of them, but I wanted to, why does this person act the way? Actually, you meet two of them. Why do they act the way they act? Why ultimately do they make the decisions that they make? If it's just because of who they are, then they might as well be human. But what if there's a cultural aspect to that? Just like there are cultural aspects to the way we act. A person from one part of the world is going to react differently to certain stimuli from a person from another part of the world. And so that to me is more interesting from an alien perspective. So my aliens, firstly, on a foundational level, are there to serve a purpose. And then I try to find the most interesting avenue to that purpose. And if it can be cultural or racial or however you want to, what did D&D do with it now? It's species. They're not races anymore. They're species or whatever it is. And so once I have that card, I have on the card, instead of, weapons and attitudes, I have literally the governmental structure. I have social structure. I have attitude towards other important races. And of course, in Legacy of Shadow, the whole point, I love subverting expectations. So I love setting something up, and then I wouldn't really call it a twist, because it usually either is foundational to the whole thing, it doesn't happen at the very end, or it happens at the beginning and sets the tone. So when I started to write Legacy of Shadow, you look at Star Wars. Star Wars is a great launching point, right? Clearly, from the Star Wars point of view, or at least the stories that we get, humans are the preeminent race or genetic group in Star Wars, and especially within the Empire, obviously. And a lot of stories are like that. Star Trek, not so much. Star Trek, we're one of many. But in most sci-fi, that's human-centric, human-oriented. Humans, they can do all these great things. What if we take that and we rush forward in time thousands of years, and humans were preeminent, but then everybody else is like, well, F that. Why would we that's, you guys suck and you're kind of violent and mean. And so humans were subjugated and then put on a single planet and left to their own devices, almost as an entertainment source for the rest of the galaxy. And the rest of the galaxy was then left to, develop on its own, and humans become almost like a boogeyman that, remember when they were in charge, things were really bad, and so over time, it like humanity, in my belief, kind of humanity goes through cycles, and I would then have to, because of the way I think the way the world works, any civilization is going to go through cycles. So you're going to have, there's a lot of talk about that now, where, democracy, empire, collapse, rebuilding, and that sort of cycle over time. And if humanity's been removed from the equation, that doesn't stop that cycle. And so what if that cycle has now reached almost a tyrannical point out in the greater galaxy, and coincidentally, a human then gets dropped back into that crucible? What would happen and what could happen? And that's fundamentally what I'm looking at in Legacy of Shadow, is this, like, everybody scares their alien babies with stories about humanity, and here are some humans, and what are they going to do now that they've showed up? And of course, you put a mega super weapon in their hands, and that kind of frames the the conversation also. But yeah, so aliens, I love them. There we go. How's that?
And they're very well done.
Well,
they all were distinct and stood out as, individual. They didn't blend together. It was never a confusing aspect of which race was this guy again, or which species. It was very well done.
Thank you.
But were there any Easter eggs or pop culture sci-fi aspects that you want to kind of tease the audience that you put in there that maybe a reader might not have picked up on?
I can guarantee you that they are, but I forget them. In the moment when I write, fair. I love doing... I wouldn't even say, well, sometimes they're Easter eggs, but they're also little homages to things that I really, like. I might drop a line in from a particularly favorite. Like, I wouldn't do this because it's too obvious, but if I ever had somebody say, what the chain of command is, it's the chain I beat you with till you do what I tell you to do. From Firefly, I love kind of like putting in little moments or characters that are inspired by the stories that have inspired me, and then I forget them until I encounter them again upon rereading before writing a sequel or things like that. So I'm sure there are, because I know I put them in all over the place, but I can't remember any of them, sadly. So I can't give anybody any insider information. You have to go find out for yourself, though.
I really enjoy doing that as well. Like, I put in my novel Rebirth of Courage, I put in a Final Fantasy VIII reference that nobody really understands until I tell them to look for it. And then my one friend who's played the game is like, "Oh, wait, is it that line there?" I'm like, "Yes." I made it so discreet that it seems like such an off-color, like, comedy remark almost, that you're like, what is that even supposed to mean? And if you get the reference, you're like, oh, okay, that's stupid, but it's funny.
Yeah. Like, well, okay, so I'll give you one example. So when I was writing Team Z shell game, there's a lot, it's a very multicultural world that Corvus Belli has created. And so there's a lot of different languages, and I had to become, but not by any means an expert in any of them, but familiar with some of them and look for phrases and use phrase books online and things like that. And one bizarre trend that I discovered online, there's a Monty Python skit about a phrase book, and in the phrase book is the phrase I'm going to get the exact quote wrong, but it is something along the lines of your
My hovercraft is full of
yes, your hovercraft is full of eels. Exactly. And so I use
on this side of the Atlantic, we all use it every day. Monty Python. It's just it's part of our language.
And indeed. And so there's more than one Monty Python Easter egg in my writing, but one of my characters as a swear does say your hovercraft is filled with eels.
Amazing. I think I might have. Wait, was it in Spanish or was it in English?
It was not in English. I don't think it was in Spanish. I want to say it was in like Croatian or Portuguese.
Okay. I translated all of them as I was reading to make sure that I understood the context. I either was like, okay, that's a thing, or I didn't. I don't know. I don't remember that one, but that's amazing.
Yeah, that's and you having to translate them all is funny too, because that leans into that other story that I tell so often that I've probably already told it in the other other episode that we did, but where I was trying to find a good spicy exclamation in Spanish for a gang leader to yell in the middle of a firefight. And when I came up with one that the internet seemed to agree was a good one, and Gutierrez thought it was hilarious because it's a very, very mild exclamation. The way he described it is if a grandfather saw his granddaughter stepping into the rose garden, he might say that. So I was like, oh, and he thought it was so funny that I had this hardened criminal yell that in the middle of a firefight. He shared it with the entire Spain office, and then they shared it with the Mexico City office. So pretty much every Spanish-speaking office of Corvus Belli, which of course is most of them, had a good laugh at my expense. And then he gave me what he said was a much better option, and I was a little bit flustered by how that had fallen out. And that was in the late stages of editing. And so I was kind of like, okay, fine, I'm just going to drop it in without Googling it. And then so they approved of the book, and then the book goes to you for final English edits. And you were like, Craig, did you Google this? This is horrifying. And it was, I don't even remember what it was in English, but it was some horrifying thing about sex with grandparents, or it was just awful. And you were just like, this isn't like you. And I was like, oh my God, Brandon, I have no idea. I just dropped it in. I'm so sorry. And we had to come up with I think I had to go back to Gutierrez. I was like, could you give me something that's kind of between get off my roses and, F your grandmother to the nth generation or whatever that was. And he gave us a little middle of the road swear. But yeah, so that's not really an Easter egg, but it connects to the hovercraft and eels scenario.
It's a tidbit of behind the scenes that our fans wouldn't know otherwise, which is one of the fun things about this. I'll get back to I'll get one final Legacy Shadow question, but I want to continue on what you just said. Is what's interesting about that is working in the Infinity setting is the core rulebook is kind of chock full of swears and doesn't hold back.
It
but what's interesting, and that's a conversation Mark and I had at the very beginning, and I had it with John Leiby as well. With our writing, with the novels, we try not to, as we try not to push that boundary so that way, anybody can pick it up and read it and enjoy it. And what's interesting is Mark cut down a lot of swears, and we still had people complaining about there's too many swears in this novel. So it's interesting to see where that fine line is of what CB deems appropriate and what they use versus what we are trying to set the standard as for our text. It's interesting.
It is. And it's going to be something that's going to happen when you have such a well-established universe already. And the fans have very, very clear expectations. And yet the PG-13 approach of Winged Hussar, which I think is the right way to go. I don't think anybody is going to read a book and say, there weren't enough swear words. I mean, they might be like, if an actual military person or a person with a lot of military experience reads a battle scene where, it's all lollipops and rainbows and fairy tales, they're going to be like, well, that's not authentic. That's not how people actually talk in those scenarios.
Right.
And that's totally valid. But at the same time, you're going to get more pushback, in my opinion, from people from the other direction. Like, I love your stuff. I wanted to give this book to my kid, but I can't do that. There's 8 F-bombs on page 1, and so it's
Right.
Especially going into an intellectual property that's already been so well established, you're going to have to strike a balance. So there, it's very tricky, right? You've got expectations from the people that are already into that IP. You have the expectations of someone whose real world experience may touch upon something similar enough that it strikes them as inauthentic if there isn't some kind of spicy language to it, right? And at the same time, you want to make your fiction as accessible as possible. That's a conversation I have with a lot of my students about comic book movies, for instance. In order for a book to be really successful, you want it to reach a wider audience than just gamers, right? If you look at Lord of the Rings, if you look at Game of Thrones, if you look at Joe Abercrombie, right? Any of these big names, Sanderson, they're reaching millions of readers. If you look at the gaming industry, you're a successful game company if a couple 100,000 people are playing your game. And those hundreds of thousands of people are going to be really, really into it. And they're going to want it to be exactly the same thing. But if you're trying to make it more accessible and more attractive to a wider audience, then you've got to take a lot of different things into consideration, which is why you have hardcore comic book people hating on, comic book movies, and why you have hardcore fans of a particular gaming IP upset if the fiction doesn't exactly fit with the established, world that they're familiar with.
Right. So we've kind of dipped our toes into talking about Infinity at this point. So let's just go head on into Team Z. What was it like going from, starting off with Wild West Exodus with us in the sandbox realm, and then going into original fiction, and then going back into a sandbox realm? How does that compare with the two mediums?
Well, it's like when you said creating your own universe is a lot of work. That's true. Most of it's fun. I would say the work goes into recording what you're doing. Like, I can come up with a really cool economic system just off the top of my head, but if I don't write it down, then it means nothing, because the next time I sit down to write, I'm going to have to reinvent it or figure out from context what it was. So that's why those cards that we were talking about mean a lot to me in my process, and why an outline means a lot, and why if you ever looked at the documents that I use when I'm writing for Infinity, it's crazy. Like, I have all those character cards, but then I have my outline, and then I have a document that is just facts, information, trivia pulled from the Infinity universe from dozens of sources. How does time work between different spaceships? What kind of holographic technology are they using? And Gutierrez and others will let me know, like in Shell Game, in Team Z Shell Game, I wanted, it's supposed to be gritty. These guys don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of tech. Well, some of them do, most of them don't. And so they're having a meeting where they're trying to put together all of these different clues as to, who's the big bad guy. And I wanted it to have a feel of just a paper littered, and they're around it going like, well, I took these notes and I took those notes. And Gutierrez helped me with the different kinds of technology that they would have, where they would have these, and I'm going to get the names, the jargon wrong, because I don't have my document up right now, but, data pads, which is, I think 40K. There's so many things in my head, like so many different universes and tech levels and, tech bases. But So all of that information is now in that document as an example. I am a huge fan when my characters are in a gunfight, I want to refer to their gun as if it's a real thing. It's a real thing with a history and a corporation behind it that made it. And there's different people who like this particular gun for a particular reason. Like in real life, when I'm reading military fiction, I really enjoy that aspect of it that kind of keys me into, like, these guys are professionals. They know what they're doing. They chose this gun for a purpose. And you don't have to go into detail about the gun, but you just need, you need a name. You need a manufacturer. You need something that anchors that gun in the universe. And for my own stuff, I go in and I make a bunch of names up and I have them in a document, all these names of gun manufacturers, things like this. With Infinity, you go into all the different, it's not in most of the background fluff, right? It's not in the Infinity 1 and then N2 and then N3 and now we're up to N4 or Code 1. They're not usually referring to the combi rifle as, Zweitek combi, they don't mention the names because that's not the focus, but in the role-playing games there are. So in the various different role-playing books, they have, for people who enjoy that level of detail, they have, little sidebar cutouts within the rules of the most popular version of a handgun is, and give you like 4 or 5 descriptions. So in my document, I have all of that information. I have all of the info. My brain is drawing an absolute blank on all the jargon, so I apologize. But all of the jargon is in that document, and so I'm pulling from all that different stuff. It's such a rich, so not to jump the gun, but I'm still in process, and it's a long process. There's been a lot going on. I haven't been as sick as Brandon, but there's a lot going on. I'm still working on the outline. I literally have the last 4 chapters of the outline to the sequel to flesh out. I have it all lined up, but I haven't fleshed it out yet. And writing that outline, my characters have to go from wherever the Nomad motherships are to Concilia Primus, or Prima, or again, I don't have any of my documents up, but
Optimus Prime, got it.
Prime, okay. So that's where they have to go. How do they get there? And then, they're going to get separated. Well, how do the circulars work? And so I go into a lot of detail in this new book in how the circulars work, how these big, vast, faster than light ships that use the wormhole networks that other ships tie into and go into, and that was days of research into scores of books. I mean, I would love to show the people who just read the stuff or just are fans of Infinity the info dump they give us for a new book. So here's the updated version of all of the PDFs, and it's just like thousands of pages of rule books and pamphlets and when they buy this model they get this 2-page pamphlet that goes with it, so here's more fluff, and you're just like, what the hell? And so digging through all of that for how do circulars work and how many circulars are there and where do the circulars go and which ones go clockwise and which ones go counterclockwise and what do the colors mean and what do the different letters mean and what would happen if this happened on a circuit, and so I did all that research. That's all in there in the outline now. And I can't remember why I was talking about this, but it's such a rich universe that you are going to contradict things because there are contradictions in it. It's thousands of pages written by hundreds of people. Absolutely. And so you can't be too afraid. But at the same time, you want to find the consensus through line, right? Or for the circulars, I want to find all these different sources, and I want to render them down into an element of my narrative that is easy to understand. So somebody reads, Team Z2, whatever it ends up being called, and none ya effing business, I think, is one of the working titles we came up with at Adepticon.
Yes.
And they'll finish that book and they'll be like, oh, I know how circulars work. That's cool. Clockwise, counterclockwise. That's really neat, And hopefully people who have read all of those thousands of pages who find a discrepancy in my description will be either aware enough to know that, well, there's discrepancies in the source material anyway. And as Games Workshop says, everything's from a certain point of view. So if there's a discrepancy, it's more related to that person's point of view, that character's point of view, than it is to any actual discrepancy in the physical universe. But you're going to run into people who aren't. They're going to find a discrepancy, and then they're going to dig into that, and they're going to get their hooks into that, and that's what they're going to be fixated on. And no offense to those people, the world needs you to go around, but those aren't the people that I'm writing for, and not particularly the kinds of people that I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with the person who read it and enjoyed the story and gave it the grace to be like, there's different perspectives.
Exactly. And there's one more question I want to ask you about Team Z before we move on to the fantasy side of things.
Okay.
I would love to spend so much more time talking about the characters because they're so... It's very much a Guardians of the Galaxy style cast, and you use so many different personalities and archetypes. But one of the things that people like to talk about in our fiction is they want to see minis of the characters. And fortunately, Mark was able to get a Kyle Hawkins mini.
Bastard.
We couldn't make it work with Team Z. But if you had to get a mini or rules made for any of the characters in the novel, who would you pick?
That's a tough one. Hanuma is the main character, and I would love a hacker. Parachit is her remote, who is slowly evolving into a combat remote. He's supposed to just be a hacker remote. Or I should say, I can't even remember. He, she, it. Parachit's going through some serious evolutions right now. So I would love to see her. There's a character, Peter, is based on one of my closest friends who passed away in 2020. I would love a model of him just because it's him.
Absolutely.
And then as far as rules go, I mean, there's two Aleph agents in the book that one's pretty and I should have done some freshening up on names and things. Radon, and I think Radon is the more standard one. I can't remember the other guy's name, but he ends up. Well, I don't want to spoil. Oh, this is Spoilerville, right?
This is spoiler, yes.
Yeah. So he dies, but he is he's in the middle of doing some dastardly thing on his own because his programming has drifted too far from Aleph's center line, and he knows that he's probably going to get rebooted when he reports back in. They're working undercover, and they've been undercover for years, and he's too empathetic to the nomads, and he knows that about himself. So he has started to establish within Arachne, which is the sort of the internet, the writ large, that the nomads use, which is completely separate from Maya, the human sphere intergalactic internet that the rest of the humans use.
Mahir is the other one, by the way.
It's what's that?
Mahir is the other one.
Oh, Mahir, yes. And Mahir, I believe, then Radon is the guy who dies.
Yes.
So Radon dies, but he's when he's dying, he's already been in the process of creating this pocket sort of file for himself within Arachne. And he just manages, as his consciousness is fading, to squirt enough of his essence into Arachne, and then within that, he has to go through an entire cyber adventure of his own to find this pocket sort of dimension that's been created to sort of save himself because he knew he would eventually need it. And then he becomes the ghost in the machine, and he's now in Arachne, where he's interacting with all of these hostile cyber entities, but at the same time reaching through into the physical world to try to help his partner Mahir, and the way the physicality of where they are when all this occurs. He starts to work through Parachit, the remote, and Parachit starts acting in a way that is really not expected of a non, there's not supposed to be a lot of AI involved in this remote, and it starts acting on its own initiative. So I would love to see some kind of rules aspect of an entity that exists within and I'm getting again, the jargon is all off. I've been out of the loop for about 2 months, but Quantronic, that's their cyber. Their cyber is Quantronic. So a character that doesn't even exist on the table, but exists in a Quantronic sense that impacts the battle in such a way that giving an advantage to their team, or working against hackers who are working against so I think there might be a cool mechanic there that would be interesting to see.
Absolutely. Today's episode is sponsored by On Military Matters, your source for new, used, and out-of-print books on military history, wargaming, and modeling. Check them out at onmilitarymatters.com and make sure to sign up for the weekly e-flyer. That's onmilitarymatters, all one word, .com. All right, so we've talked at length about your sci-fi works, but let's give some love to your fantasy works as well, because we got a couple I want to touch on. One of which being your original novel, Crimson Sand, Crimson Snow.
Yes.
Which I like what you did with that novel, because it wasn't again, this is spoiler territory, it wasn't as crucial as what you did in Team Z, because you killed the what we thought was supposed to be the protagonist in Team Z, but you more or less led us to think that the protagonist, or the first point of view protagonist in Crimson Sand, Crimson Snow, also died. Yeah. And even though he that sense of him died, we still get what comes after that. And I think that was really cool how you had Eric and, forgive me if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, Mayara?
Yeah, no, that's it.
Okay. You had the two of them as very different characters, being deuteragonists, more or less, and their journey was similar but different at the same time, and they're two completely different characters. So how was that like, writing them in the same novel, going on the same journey, but being completely different characters?
Well, that's a great question. Well,
I'm asking you to dig deep with this one.
It goes to subversion again, I think, right? Because one is a hero, and I think what you're referring to is Eric is the youngest warrior ever to be elevated to the king's personal guard. And then in a very surprise battle at the very beginning of the book, the personal guard is completely wiped out, leaving the king completely defenseless and easily manipulated, and lots of bad things happen in that kingdom because of that event. And Eric actually doesn't die. Eric is the only survivor of the king's personal retinue. And because he is so young, he feels that not only is it a dishonor to have survived, but nobody is going to believe. There has to have been a traitor involved in the ambush that completely destroys this elite unit. And he knows that. And he's sophisticated enough to know that they've been betrayed. But he's innocent enough to think that everyone will blame him, and he believes that he doesn't know who the traitor was. He's not ever going to be able to figure out who the traitor was. The betrayal had to have happened at a such higher level than anything. He's over his head to begin with as this young man in this, grizzled veteran unit, that he's knocked unconscious in the battle and he's left for dead. And when he wakes up and there's nothing but carnage, and all of these people that he's looked up to all of his life and struggled to become worthy of, they're all dead. They're all just slaughtered. And he flees. And that is his crime in his own mind, is fleeing that battlefield and then hiding. And he becomes that takes place 20, 25 years prior to the actual point of attack of the main story in the book. And so he has been a drunkard for all that time. And he has made a living being a tourney knight, right? Like a warrior that fights in these these melees for prize purses in these little towns and villages on the outskirts of civilization. There's 3 or 4 kingdoms that are all related, and then there's a massive empire to the north of them, culturally speaking, what would you say, a benign empire. And they're 2 very vastly different cultures. These little kingdoms are all one culture that's sort of Viking-esque, and then the culture to the north is very Mayan, really like enlightened Mayan culture. I wrote the book not long after returning from Peru, and I was really struck by a lot of the things that I encountered in Peru, and I really enjoyed it and appreciated it. And so that's sort of the little background piece of trivia for that. So Eric is living his life as this, kind of basically a luchador, a third-rate luchador guy who's living in these little podunk towns in the middle of nowhere on the borders of these little kingdoms that are kind of backwards compared to the big empire to the north. And he has a squire that takes care of him and has figured out who he is and really believes in him and thinks that he's got greatness, in him, and someday he's going to achieve. And that's so his squire's whole life goal is really to get Eric to wake up to his potential and to sort of re-enter the world. Meanwhile, you have Mayara, who is an orphan, and she's not a Cinderella character, really. She's not maltreated by the people who raised her, but she's raised very much as a servant, not as a daughter. And then out of the blue, this stranger comes along and says, okay, so remember when I dropped her off with you guys and you said that, you would raise her? Well, I'm taking her back now. And they're like, oh, well, we don't really want, we've kind of gotten used to her. And she's kind of like, speaking of romance, she is not romantically interested, spoiler alert, in one of the boys from the village, but he is very much romantically interested in her. So you have that romantic element that throws a wrench into the whole thing. And so the mysterious stranger takes her away and brings her up into the mountains, into this valley where there's clearly it was a castle at one point. It's all in ruins. Parts of it have been roughly restored. There's a tower element to it. And her journey is, she's nobody. She's been raised to think of herself as nobody. She's going to probably marry somebody from the village, probably this guy Kusta that she doesn't even particularly love, but he's nice, and that's how things go. And now she's told she's actually an heir to the kingdom, and she's the fulfillment of a prophecy. And so she doesn't really understand any of this stuff. That's way above her understanding of the world. And then Eric is hired by this guy to come and be her bodyguard for a very, very particular purpose. It's very alien to me to spoil my own stuff. And there is a servant there who's actually a fantastic, phenomenal warrior, probably the best warrior on the continent. But he comes from an island culture that eschews violence of any type. So if you are a person whose proclivities are towards combat and aggression, you're looked down upon. You're a third-class citizen. You either suppress those interests and those inclinations in yourself, and you live a life that leans into secondary skills and talents, or you're an outcast. You're a pariah. And so this guy has left that island, and he's been hired basically to get Eric back in shape as a bodyguard. And then great mysterious chaos ensues. See, I don't know that I physically can spoil the rest of it. But so to your question, they are 2 characters that are one's on a very much a redemptive arc, and one is on a self-discovery arc. But they're both coming from a very small place into a very large place by the end of the book. And I enjoyed that. I loved it. If I'm going to be honest about it, I think that's my first female protagonist. And I really enjoyed writing her. Hanima would be another. oh God, I can't remember her name. There's the main character in For Jamaica would be another. But I'm just I'm mentioning all this because in Brandon's notes at one point he mentioned that I only ever had one main female character, and I was like, that is untrue.
Da, 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 da. I edited it. I changed that question.
Edit
it was worded poorly.
Speaking of editing, you're the editor. So, but anyway, so
as I've talked about, the editor needs an editor. So I write these questions down very quickly.
And I can attest to that now. But yeah, so those two characters, I really enjoyed those two characters and their struggles. They both have very different struggles, but they have struggles. And Mayara's struggles become even more pronounced and more strange as unforeseen talents start to emerge in Mayara that no one foresaw, including the old man who's manipulating this entire situation to his own ends. And it all eventually ties back to the betrayal at the very beginning of the book. There's a lot going on in that book.
There is. And it's one of those things. Are we ever going to see a sequel to it? Do you want to revisit that? Or are you just kind of letting it lay low for now?
Almost everything I have written, I write so that it finishes its story, because you never can tell whether there'll be a sequel or whether there'll be an opportunity for a sequel. But there's a map for every one of those books that includes at least 3 books total to tell a larger story that is the foundation for which is laid out in that novel. So yeah, there are 2 more books that I would love to read one day, or write one. I'd love to read them one day if I just jump to that nowadays. For that, same thing for Legacy of Shadow. In fact, Legacy of Shadow, there's a 9-novel arc of 3 different series that I don't think I would ever be able to do, because that novel floated far enough in the writing process. So I guess I'm a little bit of a gardener. It floated far enough from it stayed within its own outline, but it floated far enough from that very vague 9-novel epic outline that it really would be difficult to bring it back in line with the other 2 series that I had conceived of.
And listen, if you guys are listening and you want to see more of either one of those novels, please let us know, because we'd love to keep doing more. And I'm sure we're going to do more with those in the future when we can fit them into our schedule. Craig has actually started doing some editing work for us. So that's a fun little behind the scenes note. He's been helping us with a couple of different things.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, Craig, we're going to cut the other 2 novels. We'll have to do an episode 3. This might be the first author interview we're going to have to do a 3rd episode with, because I do want to, I want to talk about Blood and Plunder Jamaica, and I do want to talk about Rise of the Alchemist. But
how could we not talk about Rise of the Alchemist? Yeah. Gotcha.
We're going to have to do part 3 as soon as, because you're working on a second Rise of the Alchemist novel. So maybe when that comes out, we'll have to revisit and do episode 3 talking about that.
Love to.
There's some other things I want to talk about, but again, we can save this all for episode 3.
Alrighty.
Craig, to end the show, we are going to do our customary quickfire questions that we ask our guests.
All right, not to be confused with rapid fire.
No, not to be confused with rapid fire. These are quick fire ones.
All right, on the spot. I'm hoist on my own petard. Go ahead.
Don't think about it. Just answer what comes to your head.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
All right, Mark, you start us off.
Okay, Craig, you ready for this?
I am. As ready as I can be.
Here goes. Question 1, quick fire. Who'd win in a fight between Han Solo and James Kirk?
Han Solo. He'd shoot.
All right, who's your... Mark, you originally said a fist fight.
Oh, yeah, fist fight.
A fist fight. I don't know. You don't really see Han Solo getting a lot of fist fights. But I'm going to say Han Solo because his fight choreography is more advanced than the 1960s fight choreography that Kirk would use.
That and for the exact same reason, that's why I'd go Kirk.
Okay. All right.
Favorite comic book character?
Favorite comic book character. I am not a big comic book reader.
Ooh.
So I'm gonna subvert your question. Favorite comic book movie character would have to be Iron Man. I hate to join a herd, but I love Iron Man's redemption arc. I love his snarkiness. I love his resourcefulness, and So with I guess
Completely fair.
Star-Lord being a close second.
Those count. Those are perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, they're good ones. They're good ones. Question 3.
Yeah.
Which is the best Space Marine chapter?
Space Wolves. And I only say that because
I'm
probably
afraid
got
that is
about
incorrect.
$10,000 invested in Space Wolves. But yeah, okay. So my loyalty to the Space Wolves is because of purely fiduciary responsibilities. Oh God, I don't know. I'm right in the middle, ironically enough, of listening to. I read the first 12 Horus Heresy novels. Now I'm listening to a streamlined reading list of them. I love the Loyalist Sons of Horus. I love the Loyalist Death Guard. I would say definitely not Alpha Legion, definitely not Ultramarines, definitely not Blood Angels, definitely not... Oh, Dark Angels are up there. They're pretty cool too. Definitely not White Scars, definitely not... there's a lot of definitely nots. Night Lords, definitely not. I had a giant Death Guard army also, but I sold it at a game store auction recently. That was about 4,000 points of Death Guard, the corrupted Death Guard, obviously. So that's a very complicated question, Mark, with a very, very complicated answer.
Yeah, I've got the correct answer actually written down here.
Oh,
it's Dark Angels.
Okay,
yeah,
well, see,
Dark Angels is the correct answer. Yeah,
I was correct answer adjacent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Dark Angels and Space Wolves, they don't get on so well.
No, they're entangled forever.
Yeah,
but I do love the Dark Angels also. I've never done a Dark Angels army, although when I was working for 40K Roleplay, I did a bunch of Space Marine roleplay characters, and miniatures. I customized a bunch of them, and one of them was a Dark Angel I was particularly proud of. No, I would allow it. I would have nothing but respect for a person who said the Dark Angels were the best chapter.
Well, I personally would say Ultramarines, but I haven't touched 40K in a very long time for reasons you both are very well aware of.
So boring.
But,
boring.
Is there an echo in here?
Question 4. Family Guy or Simpsons?
Simpsons. Family Guy, I only because I watched The Simpsons a lot, and by the time Family Guy was a thing, I wasn't really watching any of that kind of TV. I will say Seth MacFarlane, right? That's his name.
Yeah.
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 Is it Seth? I think it's Seth.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of his. I love the Orville, and so the humor and the writing I can really appreciate and enjoy. I can't remember. There was that Simpsons versus Family Guy episode that was awesome. And I think you had to kind of enjoy both to fully appreciate that.
Oh,
so I would say, I'm not saying The Simpsons are better. I would say that I just have a lot more experience with them. That's my answer.
That's fair.
Okay. Question 5. Now, bearing in mind it's been nearly a year since we recorded episode 1, but there was some foreshadowing, Blood and Plunder foreshadowing. What's the difference between a brig and a brigantine?
A brig and a brigantine? Isn't a brigantine smaller?
No,
it's the other way around.
It's okay. I mean, no. There is a correct answer.
I'm sure there is.
I think anyone listening to this won't care. The main thing was I just wanted to see you struggle.
Yeah. Oh, good. Good. Mission accomplished.
Yeah. That's it. I'd even go as far as to say I think most people would be disappointed with anyone who does know the correct answer.
Well, what is the correct answer?
But God, Brandon was about to say something.
Yeah, isn't brigantine an armor and brig a vessel?
No. Come on.
No.
Come on.
No.
Jeez.
I
Who brought
I
this?
played my
Jeez.
fantasy RPGs. I'm like 90% sure
Jeez.
Brigantine is an armor.
I believe a brigantine
gosh,
is a name for like an armored coat.
A brigandine
It's
or
like, oh.
brigandine. I was close. It was a spelling difference.
He says Ultramarines. Now he
Yeah.
drops this. Jeez.
Yeah, your stock is plummeting, Brandon. So,
That's what I'm here for.
Mark,
is I'm
what's the
comic
difference?
relief.
Come on.
You know, it's been a year since I wrote this. I hope I get this right. But both sailing vessels, both have got twin masts.
Yeah.
A brig has got square rigging on both masts. A brigantine is mixed rig.
I believe you are correct.
One square rig mast, one fore and aft.
Yeah.
I think.
And before anybody loses faith in me or doesn't want now to read for Jamaica, I had a series of cards for the different ships, just like the characters in the races when I wrote that. So I had all of that information was at my fingertips when I wrote for Jamaica.
And to be fair, Mark did just finish his second Armada novel, so Mr. I Know
okay.
boaty things.
Yeah. Top of mind.
But there
I
wasn't a
get it.
brigantine in it.
It's true. There was no brigantine. Or no brigantine and no brigandine. Just saying.
Yeah.
What appeals to you more? And you can take this in whatever category you want.
Okay.
Series or standalones?
Series. Yeah.
Perfect.
I mean, particularly if I enjoy it. My phone just decided to listen to me and try to do what I was telling it to do, but I wasn't telling it to do anything. That was super weird. If I love it, I just want to stay in that universe with those characters. I
agree.
enjoy standalones if I know going in that it's a standalone, but good books are hard enough to find that a series is a gold mine when you find it, right? And so
Absolutely.
there's always, I think, a little bit of disappointment if I pick up a standalone and it's great, because I'm like, well, I want to, their story can end and be totally successful and happy and wrap everything up and I will enjoy it. But if I enjoy it a lot, then I want to, continue. I don't want to continue. Let's see. David Eddings was one of my favorite authors in high school. The Belgariad is a phenomenal series of books. But then he wrote the
Hey, Craig.
Malorian. And the Malorian in the prologue, yes?
Mark has 2 minutes, just so you know.
Okay. Yeah, so,
so sorry.
so it's got to tell a story that continues, that I enjoy. It can't just be for the sake of writing. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much. Question 7. Painted minis, lucky or unlucky?
Unlucky in their first game, lucky after their first game.
Fair.
That's good. That's good.
Acting or directing?
Directing. Then you get to do all the acting.
Oh, yeah. Thought of that. Final one from me.
Yep.
What's the coolest color lightsaber?
Coolest color lightsaber. I'm a traditionalist. I'm going to say blue.
Yeah. 100%.
Attaboy.
It's blue all the way.
Good. I'm glad we can all agree on that.
Favorite sci-fi race?
Favorite sci-fi race.
The species, whatever.
I don't know. I can't. I got nothing. I'm
What's the
going
first thing comes to
Babylon
mind?
5. I'm going Star Wars. I'm going Star Trek. There's just too much. I like warrior. I you know what? I like poet warrior, like enlightened poet warrior aliens that are usually like the Gorn from or the Norn. No, the Gorn or Norn from Babylon 5. Loved those guys.
That's fair.
That's what I got.
All right. Well, those are excellent. Thanks for answering all of our
that
questions.
was fun.
Craig, again, it's been a great pleasure having you
Love
on the
to be
show.
here.
Like I said, we're going to have a part 3. So if you're listening, like, comment, whatever, social media, let us know what you want to see in part 3. We'll definitely have Craig back on the show. Great friend of the podcast. Great friend for Mark and I. Craig will always be involved however he wants to be.
And I love you guys too.
Yeah, fantastic
It
talking
was
to you.
great talking to you again.
Yeah.
Mark.
And we'll have another 10 questions for
Oh,
you next time.
Yes.
Sounds good to me. Thank you, Brandon.
If
I
you'd like-
always love chatting with you and hanging out, and this was fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. If you've liked what you've heard here today, you can find all of Craig's books on Amazon, whpsupplyroom.com, or any major book retailer. Just go in and talk to whoever handles your book sales in your favorite bookstore. They can order any of our books for you to buy. If you want to help us out, leave a review, tell people what you like about our products, just spread the word. That's all it's about. We're distributed by Simon & Schuster, and any of your local booksellers can order any of our books directly from them. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here today. As always, I've been Brandon Rossbaugh, ?
Yes, it worked. I've also been... I'm Mark Barber.
And I am Craig Gallant.
And we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Bye.